Welcome back. We're going to be continuing our texturing, and this time we're going to be focusing on the wood. So I'll start by creating a simple fill layer, and what I've done, I created this sort of tileable that I created from different planks, and I removed the seams between them and I blended it. And the benefit of doing that and not using a plain wood is that I'm creating a much larger surface area tileable. And instead of faking it by using a plywood texture or something that doesn't have seams, I'm now using something that has a nice continuous detail. So I'll tile it 3 times. You can see it works quite well, and also it doesn't have many wooden knots. And sometimes when you have something intricate like that, it wouldn't make sense that it would have knots all over the place. I'll plug the same texture into the roughness, and the height. And in the height channel, I will just reduce this to 2. So we can see there's some detail, but not too much, maybe even less than that in the future, we'll see. And in the roughness, I'll just add levels and I will invert it, so all the dark parts are more rough, all the crevices. And this is a bit too shiny, so I'll just try and play with those until it kind of looks okay. So this is looking nice already. What we have to do is just create some varnish, some division to planks, and some more interesting details. So I'll start by creating the varnish. Because the wood sort of retains more saturation and color, I'll just set it to something like this. Overlay, maybe not overlay because it burns the color. Let's set it to multiply because the original texture is quite bright. But we have to be careful with the values. I think this looks not too bad. Potentially a bit too dark, so we could make the material a bit whiter. So something like this. And the varnish would be a bit higher, and we could maybe even set it to normal on 50%, 75% maybe. Just so it kinda has its own height going on top. Add fill, and we will add the fill layer just to break up the height and the roughness a bit. We could try and plug something that has some sort of nice texture on it. That resembles strokes. So let's see if we can find something like that. I think this should do fine. So this kind of adds some sort of brush strokes and another level of complexity on top of the existing wooden texture. And we want to remove some of that. So add white mask, and before we do that, I'll create another layer which is going to be all the seams in between the individual planks. And this is the same approach that we're going to use for creating those stone moldings as well. So it's a fill layer with just some inset height and white roughness, and I'll add the black mask and a generator. And I'm gonna select UV border, and I'm gonna reduce the distance quite a lot. Now, I did potentially cut some of those things a bit too much, but again, I try to keep those UV islands as continuous as possible and only cut in places where distortion was too intense. So looking at the mask here, I think the only places where I should remove this, add paint, would be those corners. And other than that, it gives us a nice illusion of the door being made from a few different pieces. And it does look like those pieces correspond to the reference as well. And like I mentioned, this is the same exact workflow we're going to be using to add those individual seams onto the stone molding. So I think this is still a bit too bold, so I'm gonna make it a bit tighter. And I'm gonna reduce the bounce a bit, increase the contrast. And it does create some nice detail. I think it's a bit too uniform at the moment. So what we could do is we could try and add a filter blur slope, which by default comes in a very intense way. We're gonna set it to 0.01 and add some sharpness on top. And this gives us a bit of a nicer breakup, which also matches the nature of the wood with all the different fibers. And I think that looks nice. And we could add it actually after the varnish, just so the roughness detail comes through and we have those sort of gaps in between it. And at the moment this looks a bit uniform. What we could do is we could add to the varnish itself or to the wood or just in general a fill layer with just a gradient like this, set to, let's say, overlay or soft light on low intensity. And we could maybe play with the orientation a bit, and this gives us a bit more randomization between the different blocks of the wood from which the model is being made. And one more thing that we need to do is I would like to copy the same dust that we are using everywhere. And paste it onto the door as well. Let's call this dust. Let's see how it looks. I think it's a bit intense, so I'll just this looks fine. Potentially we could make it a bit darker. Something like this. Okay, and then some dirt. I think the dirt is definitely too intense. I think this gives us a much nicer detail. And let's see what the other one does. The other one just modulates it a bit. And I think maybe we could make it 6 and maybe set it to a bit lower, just so we have slightly more consistent breakup of the dust. Okay. Now, we might want to remove the varnish in some areas. So how could we approach this? So I'll create a fill. And I'll just add a gradient, set to plano. scale it to the scale of the door. And now we are removing the varnish, but at the moment it's very uniform. So I'll just crank the contrast, scale the balance up. So now we have this area at the bottom. And now we will start adding something that's gonna mimic a bit of paint. So let's see if we have something. Maybe we could take a look at this one and multiply. Sorry, add. And this kind of chips away at the varnish at the bottom. So this looks not too bad. We could tile it a couple of times, we could rotate it. It's a bit noisy to my taste. There's a lot of fine detail. So we could try a different texture. Something with a bit more contrast in it. Doesn't look good. What we could do is we could add levels. And this is still looking a bit too noisy. And we could add filter. And we could add blur slope to it. And if it's still too noisy, maybe we could add some filter and blur before the levels, just so it's kinda blurring and getting rid of some unnecessary detail. Clump the levels a bit more, then add the blur slope 0.1, but set the repetition a bit lower. Maybe it could be 0.5 even. Maybe I could make this more contrasty and add a second blur slope. With a smaller frequency. That looks a bit better, I think. And we could also chip away some of the wood in some of the areas, and even at some of the areas where we have those seams. So we could create a layer which wouldn't serve any purpose but to be a source of chipping. And we can add a black mask here and add a generator UV border. We can reduce it quite a lot. But now, instead of reducing it all the way, I will add a fill which is going to be Berlin noise. And I'll set it to multiply. Maybe reduce the scale and add a lot of contrast. Maybe invert it. Add anchor point, source chipping mask, and add anchor point. Sorry, add fill. And we're gonna reference the anchor point. Just gonna set it. We're gonna keep it on normal at the moment, just so we see how it looks. So gonna invert this. There's still quite a lot of it. So what I would do, I would just reduce the Berlin all the way to this, and then filter and blur slope. We could maybe use some blur direction. Just so we kind of stretch those things away from the UV seam. What I'm thinking is that this Berlin noise is not doing what I wanted to do, so instead I could maybe try and scale it in a non-uniform way. The other way. Which would give us some of those nice chips that we are looking to create. Which would start at the UVs and would go onward. Okay, this is a bit too intense, so I'll just add something on top to remove it. I do have some textures of wood which I could reuse, so I'll just use this as a mask. And just like this we are able to achieve somewhat more subtle effect that I think should work fine. Now, the wood is a bit too bright underneath, so what we could do, we could create a fill layer that kind of darkens the wood and makes it less saturated. So add black mask, add fill, . And we could even push it inward a bit. Too much. Base color. Something like this. And now we just need to set this to add. Just so, sorry, multiply. Just so we get all of this detail. And actually I want it to be dark here as well, so I'll just add anchor point here and I'll swap this to varnish. And a cool thing I could do is I could now create another fill layer with a different roughness and different height. And we could also add to the varnish just some extra detail. So now I'll just take a look at the bubbles material. I will add a black mask, add fill, varnish mask, add filter, blur, add fill, and varnish mask. Now what I'm trying to do here is I'll take a look at the mask. So at the moment it's purely white, and what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create those elevated edges around the different bubbles. So I'll create a level, so I'll invert the mask. And now I will slightly blur it, so it expands it, and now just set this to multiply. And what happens here is basically I'm referencing the original detail of where there is no varnish. Then I'm inverting it because now I want to look at the basically the difference. I'm blurring it, so I'm expanding the range, and I'm removing the original mask, and this gives us this sort of elevated edge all over the all over those areas that we've removed. And what I want to do is maybe I'll just add some grunge, like something that works well. To make sure that it's not uniform, because sometimes you just get like scratches that don't necessarily have paint or varnish bulging around them, but sometimes you do. So I think this gives us a nice subtle effect, otherwise it's like too uniform and it's all over the place. And looking at this here, we could go ahead and we could try and maybe improve it with a bit of paint. So we could always just go to paint. And get rid of some of the detail we don't like. Could maybe put it over here. But basically my important principle is that we try to create as much of this globally as we can, and only then we proceed to paint, because if we have iterations or changes in the model, we don't want to be redoing the paint. We want to create something that is as uniform and as globally applicable as possible. I think this looks nice. We could even give those bubbles a bit more of a brighter color. Just to, I'll set this to overlay. I'll set this to white. Just to make them pop a bit. And if we really wanted to push this even further, I could add a filter and blur slope to it before I'm subtracting it, just so they're not perfectly round but slightly more interesting. And maybe I could repeat the tiling too, just so you can see the shape is really broken up. So yeah, this is the same approach we can copy to the rest of the windows, except we need to swap the varnish for white and we need to make sure that it's set to something more opaque, so you don't see the underlying wood as much. And maybe at the bottom of the wood we want to create one more detail just to kinda make sure that we have some moss or whatever at the bottom. And we definitely want this before the varnish and everything else. But after the darkened wood, we could maybe just remove it in the varnish. So we could just add a fill that uses the mask of the varnish. Subtract. Sharpen, because this particular texture is slightly blurry. Something like this. And I think that looks cool. We could make it even a bit brighter, darker, sorry. And one more thing that particularly well works with varnish, we could try and add some cracks if we have a good texture for this. So looking at the varnish, I'll just add a fill here and I'll add this texture that I have of cracks and see how that looks. Subtract. It could work well. I think this one particularly is a bit too much, so we could maybe only limit it to certain areas at the bottom. So to see how we can do that, we're gonna strip those levels all the way to the bottom. This time I'll just create a mask for the top and I'll just apply it everywhere. I think maybe this is a bit too fine, which would look well in a real world, but we need to make it slightly more visible. I think this works a bit better. And this one is now set to white dodge, so it's removing it elsewhere. I'm actually considering keeping this like that, without the blur and without the paint. And actually even without the blur slope. Cool. So I think something like this works quite well. If we wanted to, we could always add some extra detail, such as, for example, having gradients on each of those panels. But I think this works quite well as it is at the moment, and we can copy this entire material onto the wooden frames of the windows. After pasting the same material on the windows, I just removed the cracks and some extra detail and added this brushed grunge onto those strips of mesh that I created to resemble some sort of mortar or some glue between the windows. And you can see that, switching to base color, you can see that it kind of creates this nice blend in between the stone and the wood. Another thing that I did, I've changed the varnish color to nearly white, and I set the blending mode to normal, and I've reduced the opacity somewhat so you can still see the underlying grunge of the wood. I think that kind of looks nice, so the next step for us would be to be working on those metal stripes. Besides the metal stripes here, we also have the metal domes and those spirals, and let's take a look at how we could texture those, and this could be as complex or as simple as you would like. I'll start with the simpler stuff, also because we don't see it as much. I'll take a look at the reference, and we can see that there is some sort of welding or some sort of metal that was added on top of those stripes to keep them together. And looking at our topology, we can easily mimic those by selecting those faces, but it will be a bit time consuming, and we could also generate a geometry just for that in Maya, which then we could use to make a mask and then use it just in texture. So I'll show you the process. I'll create a small just regular fill layer, and I'll call it welding. And before that, I'll take a look at the materials and see if there is some sort of iron or metal I could use. Because those strips are quite thin, we don't want something with too much detail, so let's take a look at this iron ore and see what it gives us. So this is definitely too much detail, so we're gonna take a look. We don't need all those edges for the time being, and this has too much relief in it, so what I could do, I could repeat it more first of all, and then I could go into the basic parameters, and I could change the height range to 0.05 and normal intensity to 0.3. And let's see what that gives us. That's a bit better, even less. Something like that. Looking at the reference, we can see that there is some sort of edge detail, which we're gonna reintroduce back, so we don't need the folder anymore. Gonna clean this up a bit. I'll try using the UV border distance because those things are cut nearly perfectly in the middle, instead of trying to generate something with curvature. It might work, it might not. I've accidentally adjusted the wrong layer, but we're gonna jump back to that very soon. Maybe something like this. Although it does create more problems than actually detail that it provides, because you can see it creates some sort of anti-aliasing result on the sides. So depending on how we see that, we might not use it, or we could just maybe reduce the intensity to 70%, or maybe even 50%. Now, those welding parts, I will just add some paint and I will add some filter and blur slope on top. And blur slope is probably my favorite filter to break up anything really, from edge damage to paint. And I do not recommend using a warp because sometimes it could be unpredictable, but you can still use it as well. And another thing I don't suggest you use is just using the metal edge wear without any breakup on top, because those things, they just tend to look very procedural. So something like this. Let's add some height. And we could keep the color, we could maybe make it more rough. But instead of setting it to normal, we'll just set it to overlay, just so we can still get some of the existing detail already. Now, looking at this, we might consider splitting it to more units if we're not getting more detail. Although the textile density is the same as on the rest of the model, but the issue here is that all those lines are diagonal, whereas the lines here are horizontal, so the pixels align better with the texture than they are here. But looking at this, I think I'll just add lower intensity to the slope. And basically the way you could approach this is you could select those faces in Maya. You could just duplicate them all over the, like delete the rest of the window, duplicate them all over the place where those windows exist, and then you could just bake a separate map either for Maya or in Substance Painter just for those faces, bring it over here and then use it here as a mask. Simply because otherwise you would have to go and select face by face, and sometimes you will also accidentally select them on the other side, which is going to be a very time-consuming process. So I would suggest to generate this mask externally from duplicated faces elsewhere. But the result of you using it should be something like this. You can see because there's not enough resolution, it's kind of smearing and looking a bit soft. But looking from a distance like this, I think it does add some detail, especially on those sides. I wouldn't use the brush because, like I said, you can paint on the other sides accidentally, so it's not ideal. Another way to do this would be possibly to just cut those faces to separate UV islands, but then you wouldn't have as much, you wouldn't have as nice breakup on the edge with blur slope. I'll reduce the height of it so it's not as prominent, and maybe give it some different color. And maybe take the mask and put it into the color. Just so it gives it a bit more interesting detail. So that's the process for those metal stripes. Let's take a look at the domes. Instead of using my existing materials, I will just try and build something from scratch. We're gonna start a smart material, and remember, when you start with a smart material, you might use as many or as few layers that are inside it. And let's take a look at bronze. So we have this default bronze corroded, which is not looking good at all. So let's take a look at if there is something here we can use. So the base metal looks a bit procedural, I'd say. Curvature dust is not something we can't add, so I'd rather build it knowing what I'm doing. And let's take a look at oxidation. Not looking great. So I'll scrap that and I'll take a look at rust instead. Now I'm using rust simply because I know the material a bit better. So this gives us a nice start, and we can then change it to a different color. And you can see it gives us a bit of a variation. Which is already nicer than what we had before, and the height should be probably way lower. So we could start with this as a base. If you have a scan of a material or a photo, even better. Looking at the reference, we can see that in some areas it's a bit more teal and bluish, and in some areas it's a bit more yellow. And there is those big black streaks that don't seem to be affecting those middle sections. And another cool thing about it is you can see the roof is a bit warped. You can see there's definitely some detail and some stretches going on, and there is some sections. So we're gonna try to mimic that. So probably I want to reduce the contrast, if I can. If not, I will just create a fill layer and I'll sample the color of my reference. Looks a bit too bright, so I'll just eyeball it and bring it down a bit and set it to, let's say, this much, or maybe even something like this. So we can still see some underlying detail, but not too much. And I'll duplicate the same layer. I'll take a look at the other channels. That looks fine. And looking at the yellowish parts, they seem to be mostly where the ambient occlusion is, but also in some other areas. So I will add a black mask, I will create a generator, I will create some dirt. Something like this. I will add a generator ambient occlusion. Invert. Something like this. Add. And this one, I'm gonna sample the color again, or at least try, and make it a bit more brownish and yellowish. Something like this. I have a few textures of my own, so at some point I just took a photo of some few metal sheets, and I think if you can manage to get a texture like this, that's gonna help you a lot with your metal texturing, because this really looks like quite a few metals. So especially if they are formed in sheets like this and they are laid on the roof. So let's maybe put it on 4. We're not gonna rotate it for obvious reason. And because our UVs are all oriented that the Y is facing up, this looks all logical and nice, and looks quite like the reference here. It does look very plasticky at the moment because we are not using any metallic, and the roughness is very simple. So I'll keep using the underlying roughness. I'll actually add it into the roughness a bit and set it to soft light. Maybe to overlay. Just so we kind of get it a bit more visible. And add black mask, add fill. And we will just add a gradient. I'll set this to soft light and base color. Make it a bit brighter. Something like this. This starts to look quite nice already. Maybe we could reduce the opacity. We could add maybe another gradient, but this time different, and rotate it 90 degrees and set to add on lower opacity, so it's kinda adding it in the areas that used to be black before. Now that's starting to look nice. Actually, maybe we could invert it. I think that looks good. I think that's actually looking better than before. And now we want to add some warping to the metal, so that's easy. We could either use Berlin or galvanic. I'll just isolate this and we can just plug it in here. Sometimes this doesn't work for me, so I just go into branches and I'll plug this one into here. By default it looks not good, so I'll just reduce the intensity to maybe 5. Still, this is too strong and too crumpled, looks a bit more like paper than metal, so I'll just give it a little bit of blur. And this kinda looks like something now. Could maybe reduce the size and increase the intensity, just so we get like bigger shapes and more detail. And then we could duplicate the same layer, duplicate it more, rotate it more, add black mask, add generator, and we could try adding it to a curvature, see how that looks. And now we have somewhat of a secondary detail here, and we could add filter, blur, slope, just to, I don't know, make it a bit more interesting. Actually, we could add it before the blur. Something like this. I think it works okay. I think looking at the reference, we are slightly missing of some of that different color between the different materials, between the different sections of the roof, sorry. So this one is this, and we could add gradient on low opacity, just to kind of have some of them more yellow, some of them more blue. I think that works well. Looking at this reference, I think there are some horizontal lines where it was kind of hammered and probably bent into shape using some sort of wooden pattern. So we could try and add that. So we're gonna have slightly darker color. More off. And what I could do, I could try to sort of isolate it with a generator, but instead I'll just create a gradient set to planar. Simply because it's on the same height on both of those. Set the repetition to none. This mask now works everywhere, which is good. And then I could create a fill building, which would be in procedurals. something like this. The problem with this Perlin that the UVs here cause it to stretch in different angles, which is not what we want, so I'll just set it to planar. Or yeah, planar would be good. We just need to make sure it works on both of them. And we want to remove it from the seams, because you can see here it's only in cavities. So a generator and curvature and subtract. Maybe subtract a bit more, something like this. Maybe not as intense. Which is actually the color. But we could maybe add some door slope, see how it looks. Just to kind of break it up in slightly different axes. Yeah, I think that works. I think that works for both of them. I think this now in general could use some of the dirt, or the dust rather, that we were using everywhere. So I think it's this one. I'll grab it from the door because the one on the door was slightly more advanced, and sometimes you will make some adjustments on different layers and you might want to kind of go back and revisit them and paste them elsewhere. Let's see how that looks. So let's start with the light. The light by default here is too strong, simply because when I was making this I wasn't intending this to be used on the domes, but I think it still will work nicely. So I think a highlight level could be low, so we could have some nice transition. And then the dirt, I think, should definitely be more prominent and less contrasted, and probably not masking edges, because otherwise they don't get as much. So I think that looks like something, but it is quite heavy, so we could do this. We could also just create, probably even better to create a gradient. As you've guessed, set to planar, and to mask it from those buttons. But not all the way, something like this, just so we get some of it. Now, blur that we were using previously actually gives us a bit more of highlight on those edges, which I actually like. Could reduce it to 0.5 just so it's not as obvious. This is the dirt. I think it is a bit too heavy, but let's see how it looks with the dirt. Now, this starts to look like the reference. And I think we could use the dust on the top. Now what we are missing are those dark, big leaks. We can start and try and block them out with whatever substance provides us, such as this grunge. And then we could try and substitute it for something else. I'm gonna grab the soot that we have. I don't know if it's gonna work the same on this material. Probably not. I'm seeing it doesn't like this reference. So let me just create a white fill. We might have to put it over the dust in this case, simply because I want those dark values, but both make sense, because then it kind of brings it a bit closer to the stonework. For the time being, I'll just put it here. And instead of all those layers, at which I will take a look later and see what I did on the other materials, I'll take a look at this and set it to spherical. We might have to do a projection individually per each dome, but because we only have two, that's not a big deal. We might, however, have to repeat it here as well, but that's something I'm not worried about too much. And let's see how it looks with a lot of contrast, maybe inverted. Doesn't look so well. So I'm gonna take a look and see if there is some texture that I have of something similar, or maybe something that I can create. After going to my personal library of textures, I was able to find something that is somewhat similar to the reference. So we're gonna see and try to make it work. Because the texture is stretched horizontally, I'll change the tiling to 3 on y-axis, and we're gonna try and move it upwards to see how it behaves, and maybe stretch it just a little bit. So something like this works. We could try and improve it a bit, and we could also try a different approach. So I'll add a paint in here and see if this will work a bit better. And I will go to particles, which normally are not very realistic, but in this case I think we might just get away with it. And I'll switch to leaks heavy, and I'll slightly stroke it over here. I'll increase the flow all the way up, and let's see what it gives us. It's not bad. We are getting a bit of a weird pattern here, which I do not like, but overall this is not very different from the reference. So I'm gonna try to play with different settings and see what we achieve. This is not too bad, we are still getting this effect. Let's see what we can do if we slightly blur it on the y-axis. That eliminates it, but the lines now are too straight. So if I compare it to the leaks that we have here, we can see how broken up it is and how none of those lines are straight. So let's try and see what we can do if we blur it a bit. If we add a bit of a warp. Not too bad. I think it could be maybe something like this. Let's compare to the reference. Maybe smaller frequency on top of that. And we could maybe try and swap one of those custom noise, those noises to custom noise. Let's see what maybe a galvanic noise is gonna give us. And let's style it a bit. I think actually this is not working too well, so I'll leave it as is. And we're gonna add some generator curvature to remove it from where it shouldn't be. Something like this. And maybe we could add another paint and we could remove some of this, but with slightly smaller brush, and let's see how it looks. Let's maybe add it below the warp. And maybe the levels should be here as well. So I think it can work in some areas, for example here, but some areas don't work well. So we can do a combination of both. So we will have to manually use this guy. And then wherever it doesn't work, we would just paint it out and we would add those leaks that were created by the generators. So I think all in all together, it might just work. When we look at the reference, it's not too different. So let's try and paint out a few areas that we know for certain that we don't want it there, that are not following the reference, and try and see and compare them side to side. We might need to use a few anchor points here and change some stuff. We can get rid of all of those because we no longer use them. So what we could do is we could just disable all of those, pull the fill layer, which is what we like, and we could add the levels on top, and then we could use paint, remove the leaks from where we don't want it. So let's just remove it from this section. And also here. Actually, I like it here, so let's just maybe keep some of it. I'm gonna enable this because this is always gonna be staying active anyway. And this one is also not as prominent. I'm gonna try and mimic some of the shapes here. Not the best brush, so I'll switch to maybe something that gives me a bit more breakup. Something like this. And for some reason the corners in the reference, they seem to not be getting any of the leaks. So the corner here, and the corners there as well. Let's see if it's applying on the other side. Interestingly, it does. Maybe there is some protective ledge here that kinda saves it from getting water. Something like this. I do want to keep some of it, just in case. I think this is definitely not something we want to keep. And also maybe this. Actually, I'll try and follow, where is it, in here. With the squiggly line, there it is. Okay, that looks good. It doesn't look good here, but we can always solve it by just duplicating the projection on this side, so we could make sure that it doesn't extend beyond its shape. None. And we could always paint it out of the top, and maybe at the top we could be able to use the ones with the generator, sorry, with the brush, with the particle brush. So something like this, and then with levels, and then some paint on top. So we're gonna add an anchor point here. So this is gonna be before the paint. And then the paint is gonna be set on normal, and then we can do all the tweaks that we want to the paint. This is the paint that removes. So what we can do is basically we can now add over here this thing, and we could remove some of the detail with this paint, and I think it works nicely. And should we want to add all the other paint that we have, we could just set this to add, and we would have much more solid stuff going on here, but we would need to take care of some of those lines here, which at the moment I don't like, so I will keep it like this. And I think what I could also do, let's see what this paint does. We do not need this any longer. What we could do is we could sample this again, an anchor point, and we could just add this to the color. We could tweak the levels within it, just so it's a bit more interesting, and set it to multiply in the color channel. Auto overlay. Let's see the difference before and after. Maybe we could make it just a tiny bit darker. Maybe, maybe not. We would have to warp the other lines, however, so let's see which is the paint This is the paint that we are stripping stuff down, so we can warp it with the warp that we have. And that breaks it up a bit more. So maybe we could set it to but now it breaks up the other stuff as well, so we would have to just play with the layers and the references to make sure that we are adding them in the correct order. What we could do is we could just add this on top. So we don't use this anymore. Sorry. We don't use this anymore, and we don't use this paint. So strip down and we would add another fill here, which would be just blank, something like this. And then we would add another anchor point. We would call it and we could add, basically I think we're already using a few layers too many. So let's see what happens if we add this guy here and then we add multiply. Okay, yeah, that does it. I think I've done a couple layers too many. So this stock definitely needs adjustments, and I'm sure that something went wrong in the in-between. So I think we can now get rid of, I think the anchor point is now in the wrong place. No, it isn't. So now what we've achieved, looking at the reference, you can see that there are darker and brighter areas, and some of the lines are looking straight, but I'm sure if we were looking at a high resolution photo, it would be a bit more warped like here. So there is some of the original copper poking through the suit, and we can see it in certain areas. We can see some of the darker areas, which we now have. And there is still some detail that we could add, but I think for the sake of explanation, this kinda shows the point. Welcome back. We're gonna finish the stonework on the model and then we're gonna shade it in this chapter. So I'll start with the main stones. Looking at this, I think that it's a bit looking too spotty. So I'll look at the mask and I'll reduce the influence of the galvanic. This is already better. And a few things that we need to take care of is adding some darker and brighter stones in the mask of the suit and also fix those things. So what I've done, I've created a few masks in Substance Designer using the same workflow I did for the windows. From this original mask that I had of the lines between the bricks, I've created this. And I also created this, which is quite straightforward. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring those into Substance Painter. And I'll take a look at the left tower, and instead of adding new channels, I'm not utilizing metallic in the stone because simply there is no need. What I'll do, I'll plug this into the metallic, and then on the very top I'll add a layer which is gonna have just blank black metallic in it, and I'll call it remove metallic, just so when I export this tower is not looking weird. And when I look at the sampler that I'm using to reference on the layers, I need to check that the metallic is also being sampled by setting it to pass-through. And what I can do now in the suit, I can maybe slightly extend the height of it a bit. Something like this. And I can add a fill layer which is sampling the metallic channel now. And as you can see now I have gradients per each individual brick, and I could set this maybe to overlay. Let's see what it does before and after. And you can see now, instead of having random lines that look a bit like a tiger, I'm having all those nice variations between the individual bricks. So that's step number one. And I would have to apply it for the rest of the model and the rest of the workflows. And another step would be to grab the tower and pretty much the other bricks that I'm using, and to duplicate them and put them in a layer. And I'll call this layer damages. And this is something you can do when you already created all the different tileable projections on your model. Instead of trying to create a dozen more channels in here, what I'll do, I'll just reuse the same layers with the correct 3D transformations, but I will swap the maps. So I no longer need this, I no longer need that. And inside all the maps, what I'll do, I'll just put a damages mask inside this base color. I will be utilizing only the base color. I can copy the sampler as well. I'll put it here inside this folder. I'll set the base color influence of the folder to none. So basically what happens, everything that happens inside this folder is being sampled by this sampler, which I'm going to call damages. Which is just basically a layer set to pass through with an anchor point. But everything that happens outside this folder is not being influenced by it at the moment. So if I set this to normal, I can see how it looks like. You can see, because I've copied the same exact layers that I was using before, all the transformations and all the alignment of the bricks is correct. So I'll set this back to 0. I'll go at the very top. I'll create a layer with inset height and white base color set to overlay, just so it brightens whatever it affects. I'll add a black mask. I will add a fill and anchor point sampler damages. And you can see now I've created a layer that is insetting everything quite uniformly at the moment, and it brightens it as well, because the stone that is freshly eroding should be brighter than the one that was affected by the atmosphere and the suit for centuries. So I'll add paint. I'll set it to black. I'll put it at the bottom and I'll set this to multiply. So now wherever I paint, you can see it creates this sort of damaged lines, and it removes the soot as well. I could put it actually under the soot, because in areas like this, you can see it brightens it but not enough. So I'll put it underneath the soot. And I'll add an anchor point, which now samples this mask. And I will add a fill damage mask, and I will subtract it. So now wherever I paint damages, there will be no soot. Now this looks a bit flat, so I'll jump back into the layer. I'll add another fill layer with only height, and I will add some dirt tileable just to break it up a bit. Maybe something like this, and I'll reduce the height quite a lot. Now, the only thing that I don't like at the moment, besides the repetition here, is that wherever I paint the transition, it ends quite smoothly. So what I can do, I can add a filter and blur slope. And I can add levels to it, which will break it up whatever I paint and create this sort of nice erosion and layering. And then I will remove it here. So this is how I would approach painting and adding damages onto the model, and you can easily just remove it from the corners wherever you can see too much repetition. And you can strategically paint it wherever you want, or just add a Perlin noise or galvanic or any other noise that you want, and you will have this effect, which I think looks pretty nice. And in case this is a bit too saturated, we could always create another fill layer and remove some of the saturation or use another blending mode. But I think for the time it will do. So one thing that I mentioned before is we can see, because of the way we tiled it, there is a lot of repetition on the corners. But this is actually a very easy fix. Because if you remember, this layer that we've created that is called Remove Brick Lines is retaining the underlying color and adding detail on top, so we could always just bring it back here. Make sure that the mask is black. And then we can start strategically painting it wherever we see the said repetition. And I think at the moment it's a bit too dark, so let's see what we have in here. Base color. So this is fine. This is not so much, so we can reduce the influence of it to something like this. And as you can see, and let's make sure that it also does it for the height, unless there is something else that affects it. So we need to make sure that the damage, we can add a paint at the top. We just need to make sure that it doesn't affect those lines. Or we could have them affected anyway and just have the fix at the very top. Because it should take care of it anyway, even with the soot and every other layer that we are adding on top. So something like this. You can always, if you have the bevel on the corner, you can always just go ahead and select those faces and maybe add some directional blow and maybe some levels and maybe some more directional blow, just to kind of feather this transition. And you can always just be a bit more sophisticated and make sure that you are not doing it at those lines. You could just either paint it out manually, or you could create a mask, or if they are evenly spaced, you can always just use a triplanar projection where you don't want it to happen. But that in a nutshell shows you how to create nicer blending of the layers on the corners. Sometimes slightly lower opacity helps to make it slightly less aggressive. And that kind of concludes the stonework on the flat areas. Let's slightly improve whatever we have here. So if you remember, we've added those seams on the doors in between the individual pieces of the wood. So I'm gonna grab the same exact layer and I'm gonna go over here. I think I need to remake the textures. Here we go, done. And I will paste this over here and let's see what we get. So we are getting a lot of the nice lines that I intended them to be in most places. We need to remove some of those, such as this one, so I'll just do it right now. Probably all of this is not needed. And those corners as well, because remember, this is looking more like wood, and on stone you would probably not have those corners. I would have to repeat the same on the other side. Now it looks a tiny bit uniform, so I'll strip it all the way to the basic layer and I'll see what we have. So we have a top-down gradient, which is fine. Instead of top-down gradient, I'll substitute it to random UVs almost, because, and I'll put it after the break lines. So we get the original projection, then we completely blur it and remove it. And you can see all the UV cuts are starting to come through. I'm adding this. It's a tiny bit too strong, so I'll just reduce it to something like this. And I can also plug it in the height, just to have different variance in between the different stones. I can plug something else in the height. I'll just reduce it quite a lot. Something like this, so it doesn't protrude too much. Maybe 5. We are getting the dust here, soot, and this. I think maybe this entire thing needs to be slightly darker. So base color, I'll set it to multiply. Something like this. And I think the break lines could be slightly brighter to match the rest of the reference. So you can see here they're quite bright and actually a bit more saturated. So this is fine. I could add a fill with galvanic just to break it up a bit. So soft light. And at the moment it's quite uniform, so what I'll do, I'll take a look at the damages here. Copy layers. And I will add it here, paste layers. And instead of sampling damages, I can bring in the same mask that I used to generate the damages mask for those bricks. So basically I've taken procedurals 0. So I've taken this one and I've removed some of the smaller spots and I made it slightly less procedural. I'll show you what I mean. Basically you can see I created slightly bigger shapes and I removed some of the smaller ones. Before I import it, I'm gonna turn it into black and white and I'll make sure that the damages are white. And I'll replace the sampler damages just with this mask to see what we get. And let's take a look. We're gonna add it everywhere. Simply because some of those things are not gonna get it by default anyway. And you can see it gives us some nice erosion in places like this. I could potentially tile it a couple of times just so it's a bit smaller. And we could maybe add a fill with a gradient. To multiply and remove it in some places. And because each individual islands are spaced and spread out across the entire UV space, this one is going to get a very different value from this one, which is why I'm getting a lot of variance and help from the gradient mask. So I think that looks cool. Could use some additional work and some help in some areas, but I think for the time being and for the sake of the explanation it's fine. And I will create one more layer with more damages. So I'll inset this just a bit more. And it does have a damage mask, which I can then use to remove it from the suit. Something like this. Maybe I could rotate or use a different gradient to have less of it. Something like this works. If I don't like any individual ones, I could always just add a paint and remove it from places I don't like. I'll create one more layer, which I will have inset height on it. And I'll try to use the light generator to have all those areas at the bottom. And actually I'll have the height to be sticking out a bit, and we could make it slightly greenish just so we can see it. And I will add dirt to it, and I'll repeat it quite a lot. Multiply. Need to make sure that attenuation doesn't exist here. That's perfect. So what I'm doing here, I'm basically trying to mimic all the buildup of different dust and grime and other stuff underneath the different moldings. And I'm overdoing it a bit, so I could definitely go into height and maybe set it to 1, or maybe just something like this. Maybe instead of green it could be just slightly darker gray. And very last thing I'll do, I will add some edge damages. So I will just create another layer. Now, because I cut those to where they cut in real life by UVs, I could use the UV border distance instead of curvature, or I could use both of them. I just need to paint out the places where I don't want them to be. And I will add the same dasher I was using, and I'll rotate it maybe 15 degrees. I'll scale it 6, multiply. And I could potentially add it to the damages. I could copy content and keep it separate if I want. I could maybe have different damages, maybe those would be like older damages. And I would definitely have to dial down the ones that I have here. I could add another maybe Berlin noise or galvanic and just multiply it and see that it removes it from the areas I previously had them on 100%. Something like this. And I can copy those layers and paste them now into areas like this, which I didn't touch before, or those ones. And I would have to make sure that I have all the basic masks, even if they are just set to black, because I'm not using them, all the different custom layers set on everything. And sometimes the procedural approach would work well on one part, but wouldn't work well on the other. So I would definitely have to jump in and see where it does work and where it doesn't, and I would have to paint it out, which is why splitting it and working in legacy workflow is slightly better, I think, for buildings specifically, than having all the UDIMs activated, simply because sometimes on one individual UDIM, one approach can work really well, and on the other one it might not. So instead of having 20 different layers, I can have just the same layer but with a slightly different mask on each of them. So what I'll do, I'll slightly balance those, I'll bring it closer to the reference. Here, for example, I would have to remove quite a lot of the soot buildup. And what I would do after this, I would create a few layers with just some green random noise, 9, and add black mask, add generator. I would just try to recreate a bit more of the variation we're getting on the stones. And maybe I would use dirt. And I would also have the green stuff building up and some lichen and some other white spots on top of the horizontal facing surfaces. Whenever you are building up different mold and different stuff, just make sure that your reference is consistent with the climate of the model that you are making, because, for example, if you have a place in England, it might not be as covered in moss as a place in Scotland. So just try and find consistent reference to follow that matches the location of your model. To do a test render, I suggest you export just the UDIMs you need. So in that case, I will be exporting just the ones you see here and plugging them into shaders. And I recommend creating different shaders for each material. For example, you would have a different shader for the walls, a different shader for the moldings, a different shader for metal, and a different shader for wood and glass. Simply because they might need some separate treatment with different channels. So what I'll do, I'll export everything on my hard drive, I'll plug those textures into the shaders, and I'll fire a test render. I'm done assigning materials, and this is just a test render in the V-Ray viewport. And I think the areas that we did focus on look good. Some green tones and some extra work and breakup here could help to also connect it to the metal. The area here definitely needs more work, so is this. But overall I'm quite happy with the result, and this is not even using displacement. I think some displacement on those broken areas would go a long way. And at this point I would really focus on having shorter and faster render times, because if you have, for example, on this entire wall a couple of metal nails, and then you're exporting 20 UDIMs of black metal map with just 2 tiny spots of white on one of them, it's not going to help you. So this is one of the reasons why I'm splitting it to different materials for glass, metal and wood because, for example, I don't want to use the opacity channel on all the wood, metal and the walls because I'm not using it. And I also don't want to use metallic on any of the other parts except the metal. And sometimes if you use metal objects but they are painted and they don't have a metal map on them, basically the map that you're using is all black, you might as well just not export it or not plug it into the shader because every extra map is gonna hinder your performance and it's gonna be loaded at render time into your memory. So try to avoid plugging unnecessary maps, and if you have one specific object that has a somewhat different treatment than the others, just give it a different material. After finishing all the shading, I've set up a simple camera in Maya just to capture the composition as close as I could of the original image. And this is what I ended up with. After this, I decided to add some extra stuff to the scene. So for example, the foreground, I just took the pieces of those walls and I've brought them forward and I've added some silhouette breakup on the closer edges because they ended up being too straight. And it was quite visible because they were up close. And having the benefit of having a library of objects I made for personal projects and for sale on ArtStation Marketplace over the years, I bought those lanterns and also this monument into the scene just to add some interest. And I did some test renders. Whenever you are working on the lighting or working on a scene, I recommend you do a test render of the whole camera movement as soon as possible just to see how it feels, because often you will focus on small things that are visible on a still image but are not so notable in a camera movement. Also, simple previews from Substance Painter can be sometimes deceiving and you can perceive your model differently once it's properly lit and shaded and has some atmosphere at the scene. Whenever you capture the atmosphere and you do some test lighting, I recommend to start with something simple because a very extreme lighting can change your perception of the model, and also some things that you need to adjust in lighting itself might seem that there are an issue in the model. For example, if you have a very red or green lighting that is very saturated and completely swallows the colors of your model, you might think that you need more texture variation and start breaking the PBR of the textures and just adding wild colors just so you can see something instead of just adjusting it in the color of the light, and then maybe just grading the image after instead. And also, one thing that I don't see people do recently as much is starting with simple gray shaders whenever you block out your lighting, because it doesn't help you having a lot of visual noise. So I'll see the renders that I got and I'll go through them and I'll show you the thought process. So I started with something simple like that, and I tried to use the CPU engine in V-Ray instead of GPU first. And I've created a bounding box with fog, which is not supported in my version of V-Ray in GPU. And I try to have more fog towards the top, as if there is like a low hanging cloud that the towers are in, like in some reference that I captured in some foggy days. You can see already in this image how straight and artificial those walls look. And I think this is a nice start. I've also created some ground, just a plane with textures on it and some sidewalk in the beginning. From here, I've tried a few different approaches. I've tried just regular fog that starts from the bottom. You can see that the top is lighter, but the bottom is much darker. And at this point I started using also denoiser because the renders were getting quite slow. And from here I've tried a few different approaches, maybe just trying in the shader to make it like the color of the sky towards the top, which is not PBR, but it achieves the same effect but in a quarter of the render time. So basically I've created a layered shader, and the top is just being overwritten by this almost emissive material with this color, so with the gradient ramp from the bottom going up. And then you can see some of it with the UDIMs that I was developing the shaders on them. And you can see it starts to look quite nice. And the more I moved on, you can see the more textures are being applied, and you can see me balancing some of them. For example, here I forgot to add some soot, also here as well, and also I forgot to apply the textures here. And whatever you see is black is just the UDIMs not being exported for that particular part. And at this point you can see I started adding some small stuff, such as those low poly curtains behind the windows, because the glass is quite opaque and you don't see much. You don't need a super detailed window, super detailed model for what's behind the window, but you still need something. Also, if you have holes in the wall on the other side, then you can see the HDRI, which is okay if your building is on a mountain or a tall place. But you do need some proper windows with proper wooden frames and glass behind it, so it doesn't seem like just a hole. Next, you can see almost all the textures applied, except this wall. And I did a test of just, like I said, cutting this wall here and bringing it over here to see how it works. It does work well, I must admit. It's one of those things where you can save some costs and reduce some work by just smartly reusing the assets you have. And also you can see at some point I decided to duplicate the same towers over here, just so there is some hint of other structure that belongs to the same building behind the courtyard that we are at. And I duplicated the same thing on the other side. I did offset the UDIMs and I used a different part of the model just so they are not identical. I've added some chimneys. I tried different lights here just to have some sort of different composition, so your eyes kind of go from here to here to here to here and upwards, because this is the most interesting area. And you can see I played with different settings, different grounds, and I've tried at some point to do some grading and see how it feels with some distortion. I mistakenly applied distortion that distorts inwards in the center, which is not correct for this type of wide lens. It should be distorting outwards, curving like a barrel like this. But you can see that this is getting us quite close to the concept, and I think that even at an early stage like this, you should have already a preset in whatever your software of choice for post-production to mimic the final result. Simply because if you are working on something that has a greenish tint in the concept or has a different lighting style, and you present something with neutral lighting that only needs a bit of grading, you might get feedback of adjusting the lights towards green, which would not be correct. But instead, if you present something like this, it also gives you an idea of which colors and parts stand out and you need to adjust. Like, for example, you can see that those walls are a smidge darker than the central part. So this is something that needs adjusting. Also at this point I realized that the clock doesn't get as much attention as it needs, and also this area that if we keep zooming into it, it doesn't look as interesting, so I decided to add some light behind the clock and change it. And this was working a bit better. And from here I tried again to add some post and see how it feels, and this is, you see, almost the final version with adding the monument on the side. And I've tried different variants of the glass. You can see though, because it's the same lantern, they have the same textures, and this is where you need to be slightly creative, maybe offset the UDIMs, the UVs of the glass panel on this side on some other place, maybe give it a different texture altogether. The texture for the metal, it's not as important because you don't really see anything, but for the glass you can see how it's mirrored, so this is something you should keep in mind. And this is what I ended up with. You can see I've modeled in the breakup on the edges and those versions. I'll go back a bit to show you how it was looking. It was looking very straight and strange. And then I just inset a few edges and added edges where the seams between the bricks are, and you can see how much of a difference it makes. And I also added some light here behind the door simply because I ended up with a puddle on the ground here, so it would look nice if there was something reflecting in it. So I've ended up slightly opening this door and putting a light behind it, so there is something here, which looks interesting. And also by moving the lanterns from this weird orientation that I had in the beginning, 45 degrees, to mounting them on the wall where they should be, I also got this nice reflection in here. So it's all about those happy accidents, and the more you try and stick to the reference and ground it in reality, the better it's going to end up looking. You can see I've tried adding different lights in different windows to see how it would look. I think this would not work well. However, what I ended up with over here and maybe adding a light here, it does work well, especially when we zoom in so we no longer focus on that area. And at this point, I also launched a render overnight, and this is what I got. So you can see in the middle we have some popping because one of the frames here was broken. But other than that, I think that already looks very nice, and it does work really well. You don't even see how much those walls are darker than the center. And at this stage, it's a good time to stop, to see what things you still need to improve. Make yourself a list of adjustments with priorities of what offends you the most and what needs to be improved first. Walk through that list, do it again, send another render overnight if you can, or if it takes you longer, and after doing it a couple of times, you're gonna end up with a nice looking environment. So, for example, looking at this camera movement, I don't like how it moves quite fast, because it definitely feels more like a drone shot going up, and it doesn't feel like a human walking forward with the camera, because the speed is way too high. So we would need to measure the distance and calculate more or less what is the proper speed for this. And I think small details like this can ruin the immersion when you have something quite realistic with super fast moving camera around it. I see that those walls are working really well, so are the lanterns. You can see that you don't see the repetition in them anymore. However, you can see in some frames there is some issues here with the intensity of the normal map, so it looks like it's broken. So need to take a look at that. So that would be my first priority, things that are obviously broken and attracting attention. And then smaller things would be smaller priority, especially like if you have something that takes a large space on the screen, that is the worst offender. So looking at this, because it's close to the lantern, and kind of looking from the lantern, this is what our eyes go to next once the lanterns move out of the frame. You can see that this particular chimney is looking not too good because it has this weird bright area, which looking elsewhere in the image it should be quite dark. And this one next to it also has a weird stain. So I definitely need to bring them in line with the rest of the image. I do like this ladder that I added. I need to add that on more of the chimneys and probably on some other parts of the roof, just so I have smaller detail with those big straight lines. And looking at the textures, I think those ones on the right, they don't work too well. And this line is quite strong, so it needs brightening like I did in here, so you can see the individual bricks. And This is where you need to pay attention to silhouette breakup. I didn't speak about it before because, again, this is something that I feel that needs to be added in the end, because the more you break up your silhouette, the more difficult it is to use Tri-Plane or texturing in Substance Painter. However, after you've done your model, you can easily just throw a material with the single UDIM on the part of the building that you want to adjust and add a couple of edge loops just like I did here and model those things in, and you're gonna get maybe 5-10% stretching on the UVs, but it's okay and it's gonna look nice. So for example, if I were to look at the right side, you can see that there is a lot of similar shapes here on the right side, and they are perfectly aligned. So if I were to grab a few vertices here and there and move some of them up and some of them down, some of them would have more bricks and some of them would have fewer bricks, which is not what we want. However, if we grab now all the vertices here together after they've been textured and we slightly move them up and down, it's gonna work better. Also, this wall, we could move some of them forward to the left, some of them backward to the right. Those lines are also quite strong, and they are probably twice as dark as they should be on the inner part. They should be quite close to what we see in here. And for example, in here we could add some leaks coming from those insets, because this is where the water would be coming from, like in here. So I think in general this area needs a tiny bit more work. I'm very happy with how this part turned out. And I think just a couple of small details, maybe some ropes hanging from those chimneys or something else like this could help. Whereas the right side does need a tiny bit of work in texturing. I feel that those things, they look a bit soft and chaotic, so I need to look at the reference and slightly balance it a bit better. The value of the walls, I'm happy with this. I think this one is getting a tiny bit too dark, so this could be lifted. And this part in the model looks a tiny bit more interesting compared to this one, because we have a monument here. So I'm considering maybe adding a couple of gargoyles to channel the water out of the wall, which would make sense because we have no gutter pipes anywhere. We could also add a couple of gutter pipes going down here to add a couple of breakup and points of interest to the wall on the left. Regarding the camera movement, I feel that also it going up towards the end feels a bit more like drone, which again, not necessarily it's not a bad thing, because drones are so common in cinematography that it's kind of expected. But I do wonder what would happen if we were to pull the camera down towards the end of the movement, and instead of consistently going and being tilted upwards to look at the clock, what if the camera was to go straight with just a bit more ease in, so I spend a bit more time in this area with this nice composition, and then it would slightly accelerate it looking up towards the end of the shot. So small things like this, which again in pipeline might not be your own concern because they will be done by different departments. Whenever you work on a personal piece, they really can help you elevate your piece to the next level, because you need to think of the small things that break the immersion, and the more you manage to make everything subtle and complementing your model and your environment, the more it will help you sell it. To break down the lighting that I'm using in here, I'll show you what I have. So basically, like I mentioned, I have each shader per material. I'm using the same material for stonework everywhere on the image. And on those lights, I conveniently had those small mantles, which I then converted to V-Ray mesh lights. So you can see them here. And I have just one single HDRI that lights the entire scene. Other than that, I have an area light here behind the clock. You can see it's just over here. There is glass in the clock, so the light shines right through it. And I think setup-wise, it's pretty simple. You can see in the outliner I've named as many of the meshes as I could. If I was working for production, I would try to combine as many meshes as possible into one. For example, you could combine all the walls into one, all the moldings into one, all the chimneys, which I kind of did here, but for example, those towers, I don't think it's a good idea to keep them separate, because if somebody wants to adjust their position, that's a good idea. So they are more flexible, but for example the roof and the walls, they could be one thing. Now the trick with that is that whenever you merge everything into one thing, you need to pay attention to the Substance Painter. The value of the displacement are the same. So for example, if you use different tileables on different walls, you need to pay attention that the 0 point, the middle point, is at the same place. And if it's not, you need to adjust the individual tileables, or maybe add a couple of fill layers with masks to balance them and bring them together. Because you might end up with some things bulging out too much and some things being inset, because the difference in displacement is not looking good on all of them, and it's not consistent. And if you have a lot of issues with that, just try and stick to splitting the model into different parts by the same texture sets and materials and UDIMs that you've used. Depending on how much time you have allocated, this is also a time to add some extra stuff on the scene. So for example, you could add pebbles on the floor, but bear in mind, if you have an extreme displacement, you're going to have some of them floating in the air and some of them intersecting with the ground. So depending on how close you get to the ground, if you're looking at it like I do from this angle, you might just be able to add some pebbles in displacement in the texture itself, which would help a lot. And the way I added water in here was just in texture. I've created, just like I did with the soot on the walls, I've created a mask for each individual stone tile, and I've added the gradient and Substance Designer in different directions. And then added Perlin noise to the whole floor, so it was kind of wobbly a bit. And I've used compared mask, which basically floods the values from a certain point up to a certain point. So for example, if you have a floor that goes from a high point to a low point, and you have another fill layer that is exactly in the middle, you would have the lower areas in your floor flooded, quote unquote, by the fill layer that you created. But you still have the higher elevation areas poking through it, just like here. And I think it works well, and even though it's a tileable, you don't really see the repetition. However, if you want to mask the repetition further, what I have in here is I have just like some strips of grass which I generated in Paint Effects, which I could just duplicate on some of those lines between the bricks, just to kind of hide and mask it a bit further. You could maybe scatter some leaves or add some extra stuff on the floor. Again, depending on how much effort you want to put into it and what story you want to tell, this is something you should look into. I think, as a rule of thumb, whenever I was creating floor or roofs, everybody was asking for puddles on them, even if the weather in the trailer or the project I was working on was always sunny or dry. I think it's a nice touch to add some slightly drying puddles, so it doesn't exactly tell you that it rained 10 minutes ago, but they do add some extra detail, such as this reflection here at the bottom. So this is something you should add. Regarding leaves, again, depending like on your setting of the environment, for example, this courtyard, if it doesn't have any trees, maybe it will not have leaves, however it might have some grass growing around, so this is something you should add. You could always add some plants and grass towards the edges of your image, and even if it's not something that's supposed to be super wild, just adding a bit, something to break up those lines helps. And in general, because those small things are usually not something you spend a lot of time on, because you either buy them in production or you just quickly model them because they're not the centerpiece of attention in the image. this is something you should have a library of like maybe small cables, electricity boxes, lanterns, grass that you adjusted from, maybe even adjusted some Megascans grass, because by default it might not necessarily be what you need for your specific purposes. For example, if you have a clump of grass but you want something that goes along the edge or maybe along the molding, those are two different things. So the more of those things you have as a library on your computer, and then moving from project to project, you could always save different variants that you've adjusted for different purposes that you can reuse in the future. The more you will make your workflow more efficient, and the faster you will be able to create those environments. After working on the notes I gave to myself, I sent this to an overnight render, and this is what I ended up with. And I think that looks good, and the majority of the issues I've had before are adjusted, so I'm happy to proceed with this to post effects. Now, when it comes to post, there isn't really a wrong or a right answer. The industry standard is Nuke and sometimes After Effects and Fusion, but DaVinci is getting more popular, so pick your software of choice. Whenever you have a render like this, you don't really need to overdo it. All you need to do is just maybe adjust some colors to kind of connect everything together, especially if you have different assets that came from different places. For example, this monument, you can see it's slightly more greenish and yellowish than the reddish stonework. So once you have a LUT or some color correction on top of everything to make it more cinematic, it's going to connect the colors slightly better. We might want to add some film grain, which always looks nice on CG renders. And especially when you have something denoised and looking super clean like this, you do want to add some extra grunge on top. And one more thing that we want is maybe distortion and chromatic aberration, because looking at this, I think we do benefit a lot from some sort of distortion, because it makes it even more claustrophobic in the beginning and makes the building a bit more imposing. And chromatic aberration, I think, when done carefully and not overdone, adds quite a lot to the image, especially something like this. So let's see what we end up with. So this is how it looks after I applied some barrel distortion. You can see the walls are slightly curving, and the middle of the image is slightly enlarged. And let's see how it looks in motion. You can see how the distortion is adding quite a lot, especially towards the end where it's kind of distorting the image. I did not want to overdo it so we don't get too much of a GoPro effect, but I think what we have here is looking quite nice and it works quite well. I think when working on something like that, the important thing to remember is that we want to prioritize the big things and focus on whatever we see the most in the frame. So having said that, the one thing that is gonna allow us the most to work on our priorities is just having the environment optimized at all times, quick render times, because this will allow us faster iterations. So if you have something contained such as this, and you have a decent graphic cards and your render engine of choice supports GPU rendering, I highly recommend you use it, because for example, each frame took me about 10 minutes on final settings with a lot of samples, and still overnight and a few hours later I was able to get out a render for 120 frames, and that was looking quite good, so I don't need to do any more adjustments on this. I didn't model any individual bricks on the sides of the walls and on the corners, simply because whatever we have done in the texture works, and wherever it doesn't work, for example those close-up walls, we were able to just adjust it with a couple of edge loops, and therefore we saved a lot of polygons, and this thing still looks quite connected. For example, you can see whenever we are getting closer towards this wall, those gargoyles are connected to bricks that are intersecting with the wall, and you can see that even though they're almost flush with the wall, and I did my best to paint them together so they wouldn't stand out as much, you can still see that they are not blending with the original wall as well as they should. So my advice, try and model, whenever you have walls, try to model them as continuous as possible without separating them to different bricks unless you have something quite extreme. Because this will allow you to have something that is looking much more consistent. This whole environment is under 30 UDIMs and it has 116K map for the sky, which is even that is questionable because the sky is getting blurred a lot by different effects on the sky and also the fog. So again, think where you can save memory and how you can speed up your render, especially in the beginning. Like for example, if you're doing test renders and you're working on the building, there is not really a reason to use 32 map for the sky when you can use maybe a 4K, simply because what you are reviewing is the building and not the sky. When it comes to post effects, I think it's all a matter of personal preference, but I was adding them one by one and seeing what adds the most render time. So for example, instead of adding depth of field in post, I actually rendered it out because we have not a lot of blur on the foreground because I'm using f4 lens. So I think if you have some depth of field that you can render out without adjusting, without adding too much to your render time, go ahead. If you can create a good looking depth of field in post, even better. However, when I tried rendering distortion, for some reason in my older version of V-Ray it added quite a lot of render time, so instead I just added this in post. I don't really see personally the difference here, so I think it was a good choice. And you can see that a lot of those assets, like for example the frames of the windows in a lot of places are used because we just see white, we don't even see the detail on them. The chimneys are the same two chimneys on those sides that are rotated 180 degrees and duplicated on that side and on this side as well. It's the same one lantern everywhere in the scene, so you can see two of them here and two of them on each sides. And you don't even see the left one, but I think it contributes a bit to the lighting. And the ground is just a tileable. I didn't even bother painting any different variations in it. All I did is just I created 8K tileable map that repeats the stones twice. I added some puddles with Berlin noise, like I mentioned before in Substance Painter with a mask. And basically I think, considering that this environment is under 30 UDIMs of optimized, and you can see that this allowed me for faster iterations, which in turn allowed me to progress with more and more feedback in the time that I allocated myself. That is all for this workshop, and I want to thank each and every one of you who watched this, and I hope you've learned something, and I hope that despite English being my third language, I was able to communicate my workflows in an efficient way. I hope that I was able to introduce a few different methods that are not so common in the industry with Maya and Substance Painter that will allow you to create something more precise and something more interesting without putting too much effort into manually hand painting each and every detail. If you want to see more of my work, feel free to visit and find me on Instagram on ArtStation, and I wish you all the best.